Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our IWSCC podcast, where we talk about all kinds of things supplier diversity, accessibility, and inclusion related. Our show today is produced by Pod Supply, as usual. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you will see that there's ASL interpretation, and that's brought to you by our supplier, Maple Communications, but also is part of the sponsorship from RBC, who has sponsored all of our ASL communications for 2023. So RBC is our 2023 ASL IWSCC leader. So we're really grateful for that. And what I'm more grateful for is to be able to talk to my friend Jade Pichette today. Jade and I have known each other, I think, about 8 or 9 years. We've sort of intersected here and there and done a little bit of work together. I always feel like there's so much more that we could be doing together, Jade, but there's only so many hours in a day. But thank you so much for being here. If you can just take a couple minutes and introduce yourself and tell us all about what you do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Deidre. It's so lovely to be here with you. So I'm Jade Pichette. I use the pronouns they and them in English, elle en français. And I'm a inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility educator and specialist, currently working at Pride at Work Canada as the Director of Programs. So in my work here at Pride at Work Canada, we are a member services nonprofit. So we work with over 250 different large employers across the country around gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation inclusion. And I've been here since 2018, and in that time certainly seen a lot of change and growth. We work with more people now around gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation inclusion, and have gotten the ability to travel the country and connect with folks directly, but also put on great programming, both virtual and in person. So it's been an interesting journey. I got into this work, a long time ago, and have really been trying to create more inclusive spaces over that time. And so that's really what drives me is an idea of how can I create more inclusive spaces for to us LGBTQIA plus communities. At the end of the day, is who I am.
So 2018, that must mean you were really early with Pride at Work when you and I first met. I know that it was early stages of IWSCC, so little babies in our jobs at that time.
Yeah, I had just started. I think you were one of the first people I think I had met formally within this role when I had started at Pride at Work back in 2018. And we've really seen the growth of both of our organizations over that time and a lot of change.
That's for sure. And in my case, more than just me running it, more than just me working at it, which is fantastic. I love that you include accessibility in your inclusion, diversity, and equity acronym. I hear ID and E and DE and I all the time. And I always just want to go and accessibility because people just don't understand that it doesn't get covered off by the other three letters. Accessibility is an additional thing that's so important. And so often when we talk to people in that space, they think they've got that covered. And so when I hear you and I hear you on the podcast, and that's one of the things that you talk about often is disability. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So how long, I know you've been, as you said, with Pride at Work Canada for 2018, but how long have you been doing this type of work, and what really got you started in helping people in this space?
So I wound up in this space more by chance than by purpose. I knew I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to support people. And I really just wound up facing a lot of barriers as a trans person out in the early 2000s. As people might imagine, there was no trans tipping point that we had reached. There was none of that. And so I had, with the help of some other folks, created an organization called Trans Youth Ottawa. And we had started initially as a more of just a social group, a place for other trans people to connect. But very quickly, we started to get asked to do presentations and engage with the community as a whole, because at the time there was very few people doing trans education. There were a few people here in Toronto, but in Ottawa at the time, there wasn't really anybody who was trans who was doing that type of education. So there was a little bit by a few specific people, but not as a whole in terms of for organizations. And so we just started getting asked to do those types of presentations, and I would go and do them, sometimes with a colleague, but often by myself. And that's how I got into the work. And I didn't expect it to become my career by any means. I went into social work to get my BSW, my Bachelor of Social Work. And then after that, tried to find work in the field. And trying to find work in the field back then as a trans person was still very difficult, even in social work and in social services. And so the Queer Community Center ended up hiring me as the education programs coordinator. And so that was kind of my first real foray into employment in this area, still in the early 2000s. And so that led to me going on to getting another degree, and eventually wound up here because the system has not changed. I think it's very different now for trans people in social work, but it certainly wasn't when I was looking for work previously. And so I sometimes say I stumbled into this work. It wasn't I ran in charging. It's I stumbled into it, and kind of now I'm here. Yeah.
Did you? We were talking about this yesterday. I went to an International Women's Day event at RBC. I was lucky enough to be invited and got to listen to Arlene Dickinson speak, which was really very cool. And she was talking about the imposter syndrome. And, it took her up until just like in her mid to late 40s to stop feeling like the imposter. And I wondered, when you were in your early stages, when people were asking you to speak, were you kind of like, okay, I don't know if I have, value in what I'm saying, but I'll give it a try. Did you experience any of that? Or did you know from the beginning that you had important stuff to say and how to say it?
I mean, at that time, I wasn't really experiencing imposter syndrome because it was very much, small presentations and small amounts of payment and all those types of things. And I knew my own lived experience that I could bring to the table. And I also had previously, even in high school, been the person who was running and created the GSA, the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, which was very early for Canada, because the first one in Canada was only in 2001, and I formed mine in 2003.
Wow.
And so I had already been in front of a group explaining queer and trans things to just other
Yes.
students. And so I had gotten my experience there. But it's later in my career that I started experiencing imposter syndrome, and really kind of, I think I go through it more today than I did when I started doing some of this. And it's not to say that I embrace it or I see that it's true. I know that it's not true. But I think it's something that, if you are from an equity deserving group and you are experiencing discrimination within your life, and then you don't see yourself reflected in the type of roles that you wind up in, then it's understandable to experience some of that imposter syndrome and to move through it. And I still work on it these days, even if I didn't have it back then.
So I interviewed her. I hate the word interview, but Colin was on our podcast. We were so happy to have him last fall, I think,
Mm.
and he was telling me about a webinar that you had put together on the intersectionality of queer trans identities with accessibility and a focus on neurodiversity. And at that time, he thought it was your absolute best webinar, best received, best put together. He couldn't say enough about what a great job you had done. And so I thought I have to get a hold of Jade and find out all about this. And so here we are. This is how I've done it. But I would love to learn, what even led you to that kind of thought process? Like, what led you to explore this kind of thing, this kind of work, accessibility with the queer and trans experience?
Well, it's easy to fall into something when you experience it every day. So, as a disabled person who's proudly disabled, proudly autistic as well, I go through the world in a way that I experience barriers. And I've obviously always been autistic, but I wasn't always disabled in some of the ways that I'm currently disabled. And so I definitely didn't think about accessibility as much at that time, when I was able to get through the world without some of those chronic and episodic disabilities that I live with. And so for me, it was just a reflection of my life, the people around me, because a lot of the people that I'm close to are queer and trans folks with disabilities, um, uh, or disabled queer and trans folks, as I prefer to say, actually. Um, and so that is my life, that is my circle, that is my world. And I can't think of things without it. Like, I think quite often we talk about equity deserving groups, but we don't look at the additional barriers that um, specifically disabled folks within those equity deserving groups um, are experiencing. And so I think that connection for disabled to us LGBTQIA plus folks, are you going to have an ASL translator who actually knows queer ASL
Mm.
terminology? Are you going to have a captioner who's going to be able to take care of captioning in a way that's inclusive to our communities? Even trying to find these providers who are inclusive is difficult. And then there's all kinds of other pieces about how so much of queer and trans life is centered in spaces that are usually not accessible also. So
Okay.
some of the most accessible events I've been to are queer and trans events, certainly, but most queer and trans events are not accessible. So it's one of those pieces that I think when you're at the intersection, it's hard to not experience and think about these things. And I hope that I'm able to educate and provide a space for those who don't experience those pieces and those intersections, so that they're able to hear our experiences in a lived way. Because I think quite often it's very difficult to be able to see the privilege that you have. And that's especially true when it comes to accessibility, where literally there are barriers, sometimes physical barriers, and non-physical barriers as well, that we experience as disabled people.
So, I mean, I have a million questions, and so many of them relate to some of your podcasts that I've heard. I'm curious to know. Well, can you give our audience maybe an idea of what sorts of things make a space accessible when it comes to events? So, for folks that are maybe not queer and trans, and then perhaps how it differentiates, or maybe things graduate into a higher layer of accessibility based on who's actually at the events. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
I definitely can. I'm bringing up a couple notes just to help me as I go through. But as I mentioned, there's the kind of some of the barriers that we see with many ASL interpreters, and actually having queer and trans knowledge. of terminology within our communities. There's the captioning issue. I don't know how many captioners I've seen who misgender trans presenters all the time based on the tone of their voice. But it can go even beyond that in terms of, when we think of neurodiverse folks, even just kind of color spectrums can be impactful. So sometimes if there's too many pieces of or too many colors that contrast in a way that is sensory overloading, sometimes even just that is a lot in a space. And as we know, queer communities, we love our color, and we love it bright, and we love it kind of all over the place. As for those who can't see, I'm currently even wearing purple, pink, and blue glasses, for example. So it really can depend, and sometimes some of these accessibility pieces may conflict when it comes to some of the needs of what our communities talk about. So our communities really do want things bright. They want things out there. We want all of that. But are we recognizing that people who have visual impairments might not be able to recognize the color contrasts? Are we recognizing that just having a rainbow doesn't necessarily fit for everybody, and not everybody is going to be able to access that and know that it's a welcoming space? We need to put other things in place. And so, I think that there are so many small pieces like washrooms that people can talk about, where the only gender neutral washroom winds up not being accessible, or the accessibility of it is limited, because quite often this is one of my main issues with working in spaces, is that you'll ask if something is accessible, but people don't really know what that means in practice. So I always have checklists that I go back to. I believe strongly in checklists when it comes to accessibility, because we're not going to be able to get everything. But one example that I haven't mentioned that I think is important is around employers with their employee assistance plans. And quite often we talk about the need for mental health and recognizing people's mental health and wellness and all of these things. But then we don't have providers who are inclusive to us LGBTQI plus communities. And if those providers are inclusive, do they also have experience working with people with different types of disability? Or are they stuck at this, you have 30 minutes and that's all, with somebody who needs to frankly speak for an hour for that same amount of 30 minutes? It really can vary in terms of what each person's accessibility needs are. And so I think we need to have checklists. We need to make sure that we are asking our providers, are you inclusive of 2S LGBTQI plus communities? Do we have providers available when it comes to employee assistance plans, ASL, closed captioning, all of these pieces? And I think I'm rambling a little bit, but I could get more specific if you would like.
Well, and those are some things that people don't necessarily think about when they're outside that community. So, for example, me being more in the disability community, although I am a lesbian, I still don't necessarily see the queer trans perspective as much as I see the disability and accessibility perspective, having a disability as well, I guess. And that's interesting, and maybe something I need to work on. So I love that, the intersectionality on that end and sharing that kind of information, because I think that so many of us don't know what we don't know. And then when we learn, then it really opens our eyes. And so when I first started getting into accessibility, I was always amazed, and I still am, but I'm less vocal about it, at how inaccessible buildings were. And so I would share that with my family, for example. And so now my family are all accessibility. I don't want to say experts, of course, because it's always changing, but they certainly know how to identify when there's areas of concern from an accessibility perspective. So I just love that you've shared that, because it's really got me thinking a lot more about that whole aspect. Changing the topic slightly, when Colin and I met last time, he mentioned too that Pride at Work had been doing some work in the area of the intersectionality between the LGBTQ2 plus group as well as neurodiversity. And so I'm really interested to learn about that and what you've learned, and where that even came from. Like, it's just such a cool topic. I just want to just tell me everything.
Yeah, so neurodiversity, for those who aren't aware, is an overarching term for folks who think in a slightly different way, whether that's being autistic, having ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and a number of other different identities or conditions. I say identities or conditions because depending on which, people define them differently. And it really is a way of seeing how our brains and how we understand the world, how we understand life can be different for each of us. And so, for instance, as an autistic person, I don't pick up on certain social cues or some of the unwritten social language that people have. And as a result, people don't necessarily, there can be miscommunication between me and neurotypical people, which can happen here and there. The reason why there's such a connection, though, with 2S LGBTQI plus communities is because there's a huge overlap. We don't fully know the reasonings why, though there are multiple explanations, but 2S LGBTQI plus communities are more likely to be neurodiverse and vice versa. And so we don't know whether that comes from the neurodiversity bringing in a sense of let's engage with the world in a different way. We understand the world in a different way, and then that translates to our sexual orientation or gender identity. We don't know if there's direct linkage of some sort, but we do know that there's a huge overlap. And so within neurodiverse communities, for instance, a lot of people are queer or trans. And in Canada, the Transpulse Canada research showcased that out of trans people in Canada, 30% were neurodiverse. And so
Wow.
if you compare that to the general population, where it ranges anywhere between 5% to or 1% to 5%, usually in most studies. I've seen some that have gone as high as saying about 10% are neurodiverse, but I don't know the validity of that. That showcases kind of this broad difference. And so when we're building spaces for queer and trans folks, if we're not considering neurodiverse folks, we're leaving out a huge portion of the community.
So, if I can just quickly ask, with regards to that 30% stat, is that also self-reported, self-identified?
It is.
And so would it be safe to say that there are even more folks than just folks that don't really, because for example, my daughter has been diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And so for so long, we didn't realize that that was the reasoning behind certain behaviors, certain attitudes, and lots of fun. And so and so I'm wondering, there must be a number of people within that 30% or over and above that that don't even recognize themselves as being neurodiverse. Would that be safe to
Definitely.
say?
I think that is safe to say. And, for myself, I mean, I'm a good example of that. I knew I was trans by my early teenage years. I knew I was queer by my early teenage years, but I didn't and I knew something was a bit different with me. I knew that, but I didn't get diagnosed as autistic till I was 35.
Okay.
And so I've lived the vast majority of my life without knowing that. And that's actually fairly common among people who are women or who are femme identified, that their age of diagnosis for a neurodiversity is more likely to be in their 30s and early 40s, because of the fact that the system has been set up and completely designed on cisgender, straight, white men. Boys, actually, I
Yeah.
should actually clarify. No, boys. And so most of the research out there has focused on that community and that way that neurodiversity shows up, instead of looking at the complexities within our communities. And so that's why within queer and trans communities, especially for women, for non binary folks, we're much less likely to have been diagnosed early on, and to have that type of have any type of support through our growing years.
So, with that diagnosis at age 35, what differences has that made in your life? Or has it made differences?
It has. It means I understand myself in a way that I never have, and that understanding is changing the way that I work. It's
Okay.
changing what I need in my work. It's explaining to me why I'm like not okay at times, why I am okay at other times, and I it really has been a almost an unlearning process, while also learning new things. So it's been a radical change for me. I cannot. I don't think diagnosis is for everyone, and I think self
Hmm.
diagnosis is valid too. I think just like at one point being queer was a diagnosis. Not that long ago, being trans was a diagnosis. In fact, when I came out, I had to be diagnosed as having gender identity disorder. That
Hmm.
the my transness was considered a disorder in and of itself. And so I think one day, certain neurodiversities may be classified in a similar way, where we are not determined as having a disorder, but what we do have is a disabling by society and disabling by not having supports, instead of our identity as it in and of itself being the issue.
So,
Uh,
another example of where current systems are creating the barriers and creating almost the disability. I mean, it happens in the physical disability, mobility disability issues. Why do we have to have stairs? Those kinds of comments. But this
yeah.
is also, we're also creating that disability in the way we don't include neurodiverse folks in our teaching and, everything really. So that's a very interesting comment, because it means there's hope for us yet. Because if we've done this already in other areas, ideally we can do it again.
And I see
When
the progress happening. I really do. I think that we are able to make these changes over time, and that you know we are still fairly early days when it comes to understanding neurodiversity, as a society, and there the first person to be diagnosed as autistic just recently passed.
hmm,
He was in his 80s, so it's something that's still very new, for not new to human experience, but new to human diagnosis. And so we'll get there. We'll get there eventually.
I'm interested in the idea of sort of self-diagnosis for this, for neurodiversity or any type of disability, because it's something I've heard more and more of, pros and cons. I hear people
Mm-hmm.
for it, I hear people against it. I know in my own experience, I think that it's really important for people to be able to self-disclose and self-determine. But I also see people in my world who say, "Oh, that's my OCD," and it's just simply because something wasn't lined up the way or something is lined up. They put the same thing in back where it belongs every time, and so they relate that to having OCD or that's my ADHD or one that being someone who lives with PTSD. I hear that bandied about often as well, like, "Oh, that I've got PTSD from that drive home." And so I mean, I understand that there obviously drive homes can be pretty horrific sometimes, but I'm just interested in your thought process in sort of how do we I hate to use the word allow, but how do we include folks that are self-identifying without any type of official diagnosis, if it's maybe coming from that place, and do we even care, I suppose?
Well, I would say that when it's coming from that place, it's not actually self-diagnosis. It's coming from, frankly, societal prejudices of what these identities and conditions are, instead of an actual understanding of these identities and conditions. And so, I see true self-diagnosis as a long process that takes time, that people have to come to an understanding for themselves. It usually requires one's own personal research. It requires engagement with other people, versus just flippantly using these terms to refer to an experience that really doesn't touch at all on that experience. I mean, you gave PTSD as an example. As somebody who also lives with PTSD, there the way that that's bandied about by people is really dismissive of the actual lived reality of those of us who have those conditions, and a lack of understanding. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's more that we need to support people in understanding who we are in terms of our identities in practice, and what does that look like in practice and in reality. And then from there, we will have a better understanding in our world, and people will feel more safe to self-diagnose. Because what I see is people who actually want to self-diagnose, who have been really looking at themselves for years, who have tried to find that space for themselves, don't feel safe to. That's what I see more often. So the people who
Okay.
actually usually have one of these conditions, or who have one of these identities, um, often don't feel safe to disclose, because they don't feel like it's going to be taken seriously, because other people do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I heard on one of your podcasts. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't matter when I listen to it because it makes no difference as to when you released it. But for me, it was just a couple of weeks ago, and you were talking about the different sort of layers of privilege when it comes to. Oh, I wish I could describe it a little more effectively, but the privilege is so relative based on who you are. So I'm a white woman, and so I have an extreme amount of privilege there, and so that changes with the fact that have a disability. It changes with the fact that I'm in the LGBT community, and so then but when we look at other people's level of privilege, you can also have someone who is a Black woman and has a higher layer of privilege perhaps over a trans Black woman. And so I'm doing a poor job of explaining this, and I apologize because your words are so much better than mine. But I was very, very interested in that entire concept and thinking about how the different layers of privilege based on your actual identity, and that we all have a little bit of privilege, or many of us have a little bit of privilege, even though we don't all have all the privilege that of course we know goes to that category of middle-aged white cisgender men. Like, so can you sort of share a little bit about that? I stumbled through it and I apologize, but I just loved the concept.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the core ideas of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. But I went through some training with Chanel Gallant back a number of years ago, who's a sex worker rights activist as well as just a powerhouse, in my opinion. And she talked about it from the perspective of always needing to reframe and think about the possibility of, as somebody who has marginalizations, how does that impact people who have the same marginalizations as you but don't have the same privileges?
Mm,
And in this
mm,
context, she was talking about race. And so that's often the context that I go to, especially as a white settler. I think about the fact that as a white settler, I bring a huge amount of privilege, even if I am neurodiverse and disabled and a queer and trans and non-binary and
yeah,
grew up poor, and despite those levels, I still have a significant amount of privilege in comparison to most trans femmes of color. And
mm,
so I have to be very aware of that and be very present of that in my work and say, in my work, how am I uplifting trans folks of color in my life, who, especially trans femmes of color? Because if I'm
mm.
not doing that, then I'm probably not serving the community as a whole, and I'm probably missing something. Because I think those of us who are from equity deserving groups, we can get very, I don't want to say stuck, but stuck on our own marginalizations, that
Yes,
we then forget our privileges. And we have to, if we're truly going to be building a coalition of people who believe in inclusion, of people who believe in creation of belonging for all, if we truly believe that, then we have to look at ourselves first.
and so that kind of leads me to winding up in this conversation. Although I'd love to just carry on for quite a bit longer. Um, your work does reflect a lot of interest in self discovery and understanding. And so, for the folks that are listening and are starting or partway through that path of self discovery, or working to understand others, as you talk about the layers of privilege, what advice might you give to help them on the journey?
Be gentle with yourself.
Mm, I love it.
I think we can be very hard on ourselves as to when we make mistakes, when we are trying to figure ourselves out, and the mistakes we can make with others when we're doing that. And so, be gentle with yourself, but also at the end of the day, we also need to be accountable. So if we make mistakes, we need to be accountable for those mistakes, and recognize the harms that we may have made along the way. And but I think also when we're trying to figure ourselves out, um, the person that we can be hardest on sometimes is ourselves. And so that being gentle with ourselves is part of that process, and that we don't figure ourselves out in one day. We don't figure out how to be inclusive in one day. This is something that takes a lifetime. And so each day we just take a tiny little step forward, and some days we take a tiny little step back, but as long as most days we're taking that tiny little step forward, that's the important piece. And I say this as somebody who is generally hard on themselves, but it's very real in terms of needing to create that space. We create space for others when we create space for ourselves.
Oh, I love that. It took us a long time to get to where we are now, so it's not going to be changing necessarily overnight. But the more we focus on the change, and for me, when people ask me this same type of question in the area of understanding and working with people with disabilities, I will often say, don't be afraid to ask a question. Don't be afraid to admit you don't know. Sometimes I think we're so busy trying to pretend we know it all that we just shy away from the stuff we don't know, and in other words, we stay less informed that way. Whereas if we just were like, okay, I don't know what I'm talking about. Somebody please help me. Did I say this properly? Or I don't understand that. So for me, that's another bit of advice that I will offer to people in the area of accessibility. If you had a genie and you had three wishes, but you were on your third, what would you wish for in the area of inclusion and accessibility in our country? What would be the thing that you would love to see happen above all other things?
Uh, Universal basic income.
Oh my God.
If I'm truly honest, that's one of the
Yeah.
biggest things, because those of us who are left behind, we are left behind, and there's no amount of corporate inclusion work that is going to fully fix that if we don't look at our society as a whole. So that's something that I truly believe very strongly on, is a universal basic income for all people, and allowing us to be able to have that economic flexibility to also create spaces for each other. And marginalized people, we're creative, we make those spaces, we know how to make those spaces, we just need the opportunity to. And right now, a small group of people have that opportunity for the rest of us, but everybody needs that opportunity.
We need our basic safety and security and needs, those
We
basic
do.
needs taken care of. I'm always saying this to folks that are like, well, how do we afford all of that? And I think, how do we afford not to do something like that, where we're supporting people and getting everyone up to a much more level playing field until we fix our the health and mental health of our society. In my feeling, we're just carrying on down this same path, creating more trauma, which creates more of all the mental health disability and all the other thing that comes along with that. So sorry, I'm on my soapbox. I'll just get down for a second. But it is something I could rant about for ages. Thank you, Jade, so much for being here. I've learned so much more, and I just love chatting with you all the time. So we need to really make some time for ourselves, maybe not on camera one of these times, to really chat and catch up. So yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time for being here today.
Happy to. Thank you.
And for those of you that are watching or listening, thanks again for joining us today. And for more information about supplier diversity and inclusion, you can visit us on our website at iwscc.ca, find us on YouTube, listen in on your favorite podcast platform. Once again, thank you to Jade for joining us from Pride at Work Canada. Please go to their website, look up their podcasts, which are absolutely fantastic to listen to. Thank you again to Pod Supply and Maple Communications, as well as RBC for covering the cost for us for 2023 for all of our ASL interpretations, which is really big. We'll see you next time.